Oh, do come in. It seems we have another little puzzle on our hands, don't we?
Death by Christmas Marzipan. Welcome, dear listeners, to Velvet Clues. I'm Connor, your narrator for tonight's tale of mystery and murder most festive. Before we begin, I wonder if you recall your first Christmas mystery. Was it a cosy evening by the fire with a classic whodunit, or perhaps a snowy afternoon spent puzzling over clues? Do share your memories in the comments below. I always enjoy hearing how mystery became part of your holiday traditions. Now then, settle in with your hot cocoa or mulled wine, and let's begin our story. Chapter 1. A festive demonstration turns fatal. The December afternoon had arrived with that particular quality of winter light that transforms even the most ordinary English village into something from a Christmas card. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her woolen scarf against the sharp air as she made her way along St. Mary Mead's High Street, observing with mild interest how the shopkeepers had outdone themselves with their festive decorations this year. Garlands of holly and ivy wound around door frames, while windows gleamed with artificial snow and twinkling lights that would continue their cheerful display well into the evening. She paused outside Pemberton's confectionery, where a hand-lettered sign announced that afternoon's special event, Traditional Christmas Confections with Mrs. Vivian Hartwell. Learn the secrets of professional holiday baking. The demonstration had attracted considerable local interest, particularly among the village ladies who prided themselves on their Christmas spreads. Through the shop window, Miss Marple could see that quite a crowd had already gathered. Mrs. Hartwell herself stood behind a marble-topped demonstration counter, her appearance every inch the successful culinary instructor. She wore a pristine white apron over a smart green dress, and her dark hair was pinned back in an elaborate arrangement that suggested both professionalism and vanity in equal measure. Miss Marple had encountered Mrs. Hartwell only recently, when the woman had moved to the village 6 months prior, establishing herself as something of an authority on traditional British confections. As Miss Marple entered the warm interior of the shop, the scent of almonds and vanilla enveloped her immediately. The demonstration area had been arranged with rows of chairs facing the counter, where Mrs. Hartwell had laid out an impressive array of ingredients and implements. Copper moulds gleamed under the lights, and various bowls contained measured portions of sugar, ground almonds, and other necessities for the afternoon's lesson. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mrs. Hartwell announced, acknowledging the lone male attendee with a gracious nod. "Today we shall be creating authentic Victorian marzipan fruits, a tradition that graced the finest Christmas tables of our ancestors. The recipes I'll be sharing come from my own extensive research into historical confectionery methods." Miss Marple settled into a chair near the back, her keen eyes taking in the assembled audience. She recognized most faces. Mrs. Bantry sat in the front row with her characteristic enthusiasm for any new domestic skill, while the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, had brought along her notebook for careful documentation. Young Lucy Pemberton, the shop owner's daughter, stood to one side with an expression of barely concealed resentment. Miss Marple had heard rumours that Lucy considered Mrs. Hartwell's demonstrations an intrusion on what had traditionally been her family's domain. "The secret to perfect marzipan," Mrs. Hartwell continued, beginning to work the almond paste with practised efficiency, "lies in achieving the proper balance of sweet and bitter almonds. Now, you must be extremely careful with bitter almonds, as they contain prussic acid. Only the smallest amount should ever be used." As she spoke, Mrs. Hartwell shaped the pale paste into miniature fruits with remarkable dexterity. Tiny pears, perfect little apples, and clusters of grapes that seemed almost real once she applied the delicate food colouring. Her hands moved with the confidence of long practice, though Miss Marple noticed a slight tremor when Lucy Pemberton moved closer to observe the technique. "I shall now demonstrate the traditional method of gilding," Mrs. Hartwell announced, producing a small brush and a pot of edible gold leaf. "This particular technique appears in a manuscript from 1847, which I was fortunate enough to discover during my research." It was as she reached for one of the completed marzipan apples that the first sign of distress appeared. Her hand paused midway, and a puzzled expression crossed her features. She blinked rapidly, then attempted to continue, but her movements had become noticeably unsteady. "I do apologize," she said, her voice suddenly strained. "I seem to be feeling rather peculiar." Before anyone could respond, Mrs. Hartwell had collapsed behind the counter, sending several of the carefully crafted confections scattering across the floor. Chapter 2. Bitter Almonds and Old Secrets. The peaceful atmosphere of Pemberton's confectionery transformed instantly into controlled chaos as Mrs. Hartwell crumpled to the floor. Several ladies gasped in alarm while others rose from their seats, uncertain whether to assist or maintain a respectful distance. Miss Marple, despite her years, moved with surprising swiftness toward the demonstration counter, her experience with medical emergencies lending her a calm authority that others instinctively recognized. "Please stand back," she said gently but firmly, kneeling beside the fallen woman. "Mrs. Bantry, would you be so kind as to telephone for Dr. Haydock immediately?" As Dolly Bantry hurried toward the shop's telephone, Miss Marple observed Mrs. Hartwell's condition with growing concern. The woman's breathing was laboured and irregular, and there was an unmistakable scent in the air that caused Miss Marple's expression to grow grave. The bitter almond. Odour was faint but distinct to someone who knew what to look for. Young Lucy Pemberton had rushed forward from her position by the wall, her earlier resentment replaced by what appeared to be genuine distress. "Is she having some sort of attack?" she asked, wringing her hands. "Should we give her water?" "I think not," Miss Marple replied carefully, noting the slight blue tinge appearing around Mrs. Hartwell's lips. "We must wait for the doctor, though I fear—" She left the sentence unfinished, but her meaning was clear to those who observed her troubled expression. Dr. Haydock arrived within minutes, his medical bag in hand, and his face set in professional concentration. He knelt beside Mrs. Hartwell, conducting a rapid examination while the assembled audience maintained an anxious vigil. His expression grew increasingly grim as he worked, finally sitting back on his heels with a definitive shake of his head. "I'm afraid she's gone," he announced quietly. "And given the symptoms and that distinctive odour, I must insist that no one touch anything on this counter. This appears to be a case of cyanide poisoning." The word cyanide rippled through the gathered crowd like a stone dropped in still water. Several of the ladies pressed handkerchiefs to their mouths, while others simply stared in disbelief at the scene before them. The festive marzipan fruits, so carefully crafted just moments before, now seemed sinister in their innocent appearance. "But that's impossible," Lucy Pemberton protested, her voice rising slightly. "She was just demonstrating. She only tasted one small piece of marzipan to show us the proper texture. How could anyone poison her in front of all these witnesses?" Miss Marple rose carefully from her position beside the body, her observant gaze taking in every detail of the demonstration area. The various bowls of ingredients remained undisturbed, the copper moulds still gleamed under the lights, and the scattered marzipan fruits lay where they had fallen during Mrs. Hartwell's collapse. Yet something about the arrangement troubled her, some detail that didn't quite fit the pattern of an accidental poisoning. "Dr. Haydock," she said thoughtfully. "Mrs. Hartwell mentioned using bitter almonds in her recipe. She specifically warned about their prussic acid content. Could she have simply used too much by accident?" The doctor considered this possibility while examining the ingredients on the counter. It would take a considerable amount of bitter almonds to cause such a rapid and fatal reaction. No experienced confectioner would make such an error. He paused, his expression darkening. "I'm afraid we must contact the police immediately. This appears to be deliberate poisoning." As they waited for the authorities to arrive, Miss Marple found herself studying the faces of those present. Each person's reaction to the tragedy revealed something about their relationship with the deceased. Mrs. Clement appeared genuinely shocked, her normally composed features drawn with distress. Mrs. Bantry had adopted her characteristic response to crisis, bustling about making tea for those who seemed most affected. But it was Lucy Pemberton who drew Miss Marple's particular attention. The young woman stood apart from the others, her gaze fixed on the demonstration counter, with an expression that seemed to combine various emotions. Shock certainly, but also something else. Relief, vindication. Miss Marple filed this observation away for future consideration, her mind already beginning to construct possible explanations for what had occurred. "Did anyone else sample the marzipan?" Dr. Haydock asked suddenly, causing several people to step back involuntarily from the counter. No, Mrs. Bantry replied promptly. Mrs. Hartwell was very particular about that. She said we would all have opportunity to taste once the demonstration was complete, but she wanted us to observe the technique first. Inspector Slack arrived with his characteristic efficiency, immediately securing the scene and beginning his preliminary questioning of witnesses. Miss Marple listened carefully to each person's account, noting the subtle variations in their stories and the small details that might prove significant. One thing became increasingly clear. Mrs. Hartwell had been the only person to consume any of the marzipan, and she had selected the piece herself from among the many she had crafted. Most peculiar, Miss Marple murmured to herself, her keen mind already working through the implications. Most peculiar indeed. Chapter 3. The Recipe Book Discovery. Inspector Slack had transformed Pemberton's confectionery into an impromptu investigation headquarters, with constables stationed at both entrances, and the demonstration area sealed off with official tape. The witnesses had been asked to remain for formal statements, and the atmosphere had shifted from festive anticipation to uncomfortable tension. Miss Marple observed the proceedings with her characteristic quiet attention, positioning herself where she could both see and hear without appearing to interfere with official matters. Now then, Inspector Slack announced, consulting his notebook with professional gravity, I'll need to search Mrs. Hartwell's belongings for any evidence that might explain this tragedy. Does anyone know where she kept her personal items? Lucy Pemberton stepped forward hesitantly. She always brought a leather satchel with her recipes and supplies. She was very protective of it, never let anyone else handle it. She pointed toward a vintage leather bag resting on a shelf behind the counter. That's it there. As Inspector Slack began examining the bag's contents, Miss Marple noticed Lucy's expression tighten with what appeared to be anticipation. The young woman seemed to be holding her breath, waiting for something specific to be discovered. This reaction intrigued Miss Marple considerably, suggesting that Lucy possessed knowledge about Mrs. Hartwell that she had not yet shared with the authorities. The inspector withdrew several items from the satchel, a worn notebook filled with measurements and instructions, various small containers of flavourings and colourings, and finally, a leather-bound book that appeared considerably older than the other items. Its covers were cracked with age, and the pages showed the yellowing that came with decades of use. Peculiar, Slack muttered, opening the book carefully. This appears to be handwritten recipes, but the writing doesn't match the notebook. Different hand entirely. Miss Marple moved closer, her interest clearly piqued. May I see, Inspector? I have some small experience with old household manuscripts. Slack handed her the book with only minor reluctance, having learned from previous encounters that Miss Marple's observations often prove valuable. As she examined the pages, her expression grew increasingly thoughtful. The recipes were indeed written in an elegant Victorian script, with detailed instructions for various confections and preserves. What caught her attention particularly was an inscription on the inside cover. To my beloved daughter Charlotte, may these recipes bring joy to future generations. Eleanor Ashford, 1923. Charlotte Ashford, Miss Marple said aloud. Why does that name seem familiar? Because she was my grandmother, Lucy Pemberton said suddenly, her voice carrying a mixture of anger and satisfaction. And that book belongs to my family. Mrs. Hartwell stole it. All eyes turned toward the young woman, who stood with her chin raised defiantly despite the tears beginning to form in her eyes. Inspector Slack immediately focused his attention on this unexpected development. Stole it, you say? That's quite an accusation, Miss Pemberton. Can you provide proof of ownership? Lucy nodded vigorously. My grandmother, Charlotte Ashford, was renowned for her confectionery skills before she married my grandfather and became Charlotte Pemberton. She inherited that book from her mother, Eleanor, and it should have passed to me. Mrs. Hartwell worked as my grandmother's companion during her final years. After grandmother died, the recipe book disappeared, along with several other valuable items. When did your grandmother pass away? Miss Marple inquired gently. 2 years ago this Christmas, Lucy replied, her voice catching slightly. Mrs. Hartwell left the village shortly afterward, claiming she had been offered a position in London. Then, 6 months ago, she returned as this celebrated confectionery expert, demonstrating recipes that I recognized immediately as coming from my grandmother's book. She had simply changed a few ingredients here and there, but the techniques, the methods, they were all grandmother's. Mrs. Bantry gasped audibly. Do you mean to say that Mrs. Hartwell had been passing off your grandmother's recipes as her own research? Exactly, Lucy confirmed with bitter satisfaction. She even published a cookbook last year, Traditional Victorian Confections Rediscovered. Every single recipe in it came from my grandmother's collection. She was making money from my family's legacy while I struggled to keep the shop running without the recipes that should have been mine. Inspector Slack absorbed this information with obvious interest. Did you confront Mrs. Hartwell about this alleged theft? Lucy hesitated before answering. I tried several times, but she always denied it, claimed the recipes were from her own research in various archives. She said the similarities were pure coincidence, that traditional recipes often resembled each other. Without the actual book as proof, I couldn't do anything. She was always so careful to keep it hidden. Miss Marple had been leafing through the recipe book during this exchange, her practised eye noting various details. She paused at a page that had been marked with a pressed violet, now faded with age. The recipe was for Christmas marzipan fruits, and someone had made recent notations in the margins with different ink. Inspector, she said carefully, I believe you should examine this particular page. The margin notes appear to be in Mrs. Hartwell's handwriting, and they specifically mention increasing the proportion of bitter almonds for enhanced flavour. Slack studied the page with growing interest. Increased from 1 part in 20 to 3 parts in 20. That would certainly create a dangerous concentration of prussic acid. But Mrs. Hartwell would have known that, Dr. Haydock interjected, having remained to assist with the investigation. She explicitly warned about the dangers during her demonstration. Why would she deliberately create such a lethal mixture? Miss Marple considered this paradox carefully, her mind working through the various possibilities. The stolen recipe book provided clear motive for Lucy Pemberton to wish Mrs. Hartwell ill, yet the victim had prepared and consumed the poisoned marzipan herself. It seemed impossible that anyone else could have intervened without being observed by the numerous witnesses present. Miss Pemberton, she asked thoughtfully, did you assist with any of the preparation for today's demonstration? No, Lucy replied firmly. Mrs. Hartwell never allowed me near her preparations. She arrived early this morning and set everything up herself. I wasn't even in the shop when she prepared the almond paste base. She insisted on having the space to herself for what she called her mise en place. Yet even as Lucy spoke, Miss Marple noticed something significant. The young woman's hands bore faint stains that appeared to be from food colouring, the same distinctive shades that Mrs. Hartwell had used to paint her marzipan fruits. This observation raised new questions about Lucy's actual involvement in the day's tragic events. Chapter 4. A Violet's Silent Testament. The investigation had reached a temporary standstill as Inspector Slack awaited the arrival of forensic specialists from the county headquarters. The witnesses remained gathered in uncomfortable clusters throughout the shop, their hushed conversations occasionally punctuated by the sound of police photographers documenting the scene. Miss Marple had settled herself in a corner chair, ostensibly resting, but actually observing the various dynamics playing out among those present. She found her attention repeatedly drawn to the pressed violet, marking the marzipan recipe in Charlotte Ashford's book. There was something poignant about that faded flower, placed there by someone who clearly valued that particular page. Violets had been Charlotte Pemberton's favourite flower, according to village memory. The elderly lady had grown them in her garden and often wore a small bunch pinned to her coat during their blooming season. Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple said quietly, drawing her friend aside. You knew Charlotte Pemberton quite well, didn't you, during her final years? Dolly Bantry nodded thoughtfully. Yes, though she became rather reclusive after her husband died. She spent most of her time in her kitchen, experimenting with recipes. Lucy tried to help, but Charlotte insisted she was too young to understand the subtleties of proper confectionery work. It caused some friction between them, I'm afraid. And Mrs. Hartwell was her companion during this period. Companion and nurse, really. Charlotte's health was failing, and she needed someone constantly present. Vivian Hartwell seemed devoted to her, always attentive, always eager to assist. Charlotte even changed her will to leave her a small legacy in gratitude for her care. Mrs. Bantry paused, her expression growing troubled. Lucy was furious about that. She felt Mrs. Hartwell had manipulated her grandmother. Miss Marple absorbed this information while watching Lucy Pemberton across the room. The young woman was speaking earnestly with Inspector Slack, gesturing emphatically as she apparently provided additional details about her grandmother's relationship with Mrs. Hartwell. Yet something about her demeanour struck Miss Marple as rehearsed, as though she had prepared her words carefully in advance. Dr. Haydock approached Miss Marple with a concerned expression. "I've been thinking about the poisoning mechanism," he said quietly. The concentration of bitter almonds in that marzipan would have been immediately noticeable to anyone with confectionery experience. The taste would be overwhelmingly bitter, quite impossible to mistake for properly prepared marzipan. Yet, Mrs. Hartwell consumed it without hesitation, Miss Marple observed. She even commented on the texture being perfect. Most curious. Unless, the doctor suggested, she had temporarily lost her sense of taste. There are several conditions or substances that could cause such an effect. This possibility opened new avenues of consideration. Miss Marple rose from her chair and approached the demonstration counter where the forensic team had begun their detailed analysis. Among the various implements and ingredients, she noticed a small electric kettle and a cup containing the dregs of what appeared to be herbal tea. "Inspector Slack," she called politely. "Might I suggest that this teacup be tested? It may prove significant." Slack examined the cup with professional interest. "Mrs. Hartwell's, you think?" "Almost certainly. She was known to drink a special blend of herbal tea before her demonstrations, claiming it soothed her throat for speaking." Miss Marple turned toward Lucy Pemberton. "Miss Pemberton, did you observe Mrs. Hartwell preparing her tea this morning?" Lucy's response came perhaps a moment too quickly. "No, as I said, she preferred to prepare everything alone. The tea was already made when I arrived to open the shop for customers." Yet even as she spoke, Miss Marple noticed the young woman's unconscious gesture of touching her pocket, where the outline of what appeared to be a small bottle was visible. This detail, combined with the food colouring stains on her hands, began to form a pattern in Miss Marple's mind. "There's something else," announced one of the forensic specialists, who had been examining the scattered marzipan fruits. "These pieces here, the ones that fell when Mrs. Hartwell collapsed, they show two distinct preparation methods. Some were made with standard sweet almonds only, quite safe to consume. Others contain the dangerous concentration of bitter almonds. They were made at different times." Inspector Slack seized upon this information immediately. "So someone prepared poisoned marzipan in advance and somehow substituted it for the safe version?" "It would appear so," the specialist confirmed. "The colour patterns are slightly different too, suggesting different batches of food colouring were used." Miss Marple studied the scattered confections with renewed interest. The poisoned pieces did indeed show subtle variations in their colouring, particularly in the red and green hues used for the apples and pears. She thought again of the stains on Lucy's hands, and the careful way the young woman had positioned herself during the demonstration, always staying just at the edge of Mrs. Hartwell's peripheral vision. "Miss Pemberton," Inspector Slack said formally, "I'll need you to explain those stains on your hands. They appear to match the food colouring used in these marzipan fruits." Lucy looked down at her hands, as though seeing them for the first time. I was experimenting this morning, before the shop opened. I wanted to practice the techniques my grandmother had taught me, to prove I could make marzipan just as well as Mrs. Hartwell." "And where are these practice pieces now?" the inspector pressed. "I threw them away. They weren't very good. The proportions were all wrong." Lucy's voice had grown defensive, and she crossed her arms tightly across her chest. Miss Marple noticed that several of the witnesses were now watching Lucy with expressions of dawning suspicion. The young woman had both motive and opportunity, and her explanations were becoming increasingly unconvincing. Yet something about the situation continued to trouble Miss Marple. The complexity of the poisoning method seemed at odds with what she knew of Lucy's character. "Inspector," she suggested gently, "perhaps we might examine the shop's storage areas. If Miss Pemberton was practicing this morning, there might be evidence of her work." As Slack directed his team to search the shop's back rooms, Miss Marple found herself drawn once again to Charlotte Ashford's recipe book. She turned the pages carefully, noting which recipes had been annotated recently and which remained in their original state. A pattern emerged. Every recipe that Mrs. Hartwell had demonstrated publicly had been marked with small symbols in the margins, a kind of code that suggested planning and organisation. The search of the storage areas yielded unexpected results. The constables discovered not one but two sets of marzipan-making equipment, each with residues of almond paste at different stages of preparation. More significantly, they found a small waste bin containing discarded marzipan pieces that bore an unmistakable resemblance to those that had poisoned Mrs. Hartwell. "Well, Miss Pemberton," Inspector Slack said grimly, "I think you have some serious explaining to do." Chapter 5. The Letters in the Ledger. Lucy Pemberton's composure finally cracked under the weight of mounting evidence. She sank into a chair, her face pale and her hands trembling visibly. The shop had grown quiet except for the sound of her ragged breathing and the distant church bells marking the late afternoon hour. Inspector Slack stood before her with his notebook ready, his expression combining professional determination with a hint of sympathy for the young woman's obvious distress. "I didn't mean for this to happen," Lucy said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You have to understand, she stole everything from my family. Our recipes, our reputation, our legacy. She built her entire career on my grandmother's work, while I watched this shop struggle without the knowledge that was rightfully mine." Miss Marple moved closer, her gentle presence somehow encouraging confession rather than demanding it. "Perhaps, my dear, you should start from the beginning. When did you first realise that Mrs. Hartwell had taken your grandmother's recipe book?" Lucy drew a shuddering breath before responding. "About 3 months after grandmother died. I was going through her belongings, trying to organise everything, when I realised several important items were missing. The recipe book, of course, but also her correspondence with famous chefs, her collection of Victorian moulds, and most importantly, a series of letters she had been writing to compile her memoirs." "Letters?" Inspector Slack interjected. "What kind of letters?" "Grandmother had been documenting the history of each recipe," Lucy explained. "Where it came from, how it had been modified over generations, the occasions when it had been served. She intended to publish them as a cookbook combined with family history. Mrs. Hartwell knew about this project because she had been helping grandmother organise the materials." Miss Marple noticed that several of the witnesses had drawn closer, drawn by the unfolding narrative. Mrs. Bantry in particular seemed deeply affected by these revelations, perhaps remembering her own interactions with Charlotte Pemberton during those final years. "When Mrs. Hartwell left the village," Lucy continued, "I assumed she had simply moved on to another position. It wasn't until she returned 6 months ago, announcing her demonstrations and cookbook, that I realised what had happened. She had spent the intervening time studying my grandmother's materials, mastering the techniques and preparing to launch herself as an expert." "But surely you could have taken legal action," Dr. Haydock suggested. "Theft is theft, regardless of the items involved." Lucy laughed bitterly. "With what proof? Mrs. Hartwell was clever. She had changed just enough details to make the recipes seem like her own discoveries. She claimed any similarities were due to studying the same historical sources. Without the original book and letters, I had no evidence. Even when I recognised specific techniques that my grandmother had developed, unique methods that appeared nowhere else in culinary history, Mrs. Hartwell simply claimed parallel development." Miss Marple had been observing Lucy's expressions carefully throughout this recitation. The young woman's anger appeared genuine, as did her grief over her grandmother's legacy. Yet there remained the question of how the poisoned marzipan had come to be consumed by Mrs. Hartwell herself. "Tell us about this morning," Miss Marple prompted gently. "You said you were practicing marzipan techniques. Was that entirely true?" Lucy hesitated, then shook her head slowly. "Not exactly. I did make marzipan, but not for practice. I wanted to prove that I could recreate my grandmother's recipes perfectly, even without the book. I used her exact proportions, including the small amount of bitter almond she always insisted gave the proper depth of flavour. But the poisoned pieces contained far more than a small amount," Inspector Slack pointed out. "The concentration was lethal." "I know that now," Lucy said miserably. "But I followed what I thought was my grandmother's recipe exactly. 1 part bitter almonds to 20 parts sweet. It should have been perfectly safe." Miss Marple and Dr. Haydock exchanged meaningful glances. The proportions Lucy described would indeed be safe, yet the analysis had shown a much higher concentration in the poisoned pieces. This discrepancy suggested that someone else had been involved in the preparation, or that Lucy was not being entirely truthful about her actions. "Miss Pemberton," Miss Marple said carefully, "I noticed you touching your pocket earlier. Might I ask what you're carrying?" Lucy reluctantly withdrew a small bottle from her pocket. It contained a clear liquid that caught the light like water, but had a slightly oily consistency. "It's bitter almond extract," she admitted. "Much more concentrated than using actual bitter almonds. I brought it thinking I might add it to Mrs. Hartwell's preparations somehow, to make her sick during the demonstration, to embarrass her. But I didn't use it, I swear. I couldn't bring myself to actually do it." Inspector Slack took the bottle carefully, holding it up to the light. This could easily account for the lethal concentration in the marzipan. A few drops of this in the almond paste would be enough to kill. The revelation cast new suspicion on Lucy's story. She had admitted to planning to sabotage the demonstration, had possessed the means to create the poison, and had clear motive for wanting to harm Mrs. Hartwell. Yet Miss Marple continued to sense that something was missing from the narrative. "There's another possibility," suggested Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, speaking up for the first time. "What if Mrs. Hartwell herself made an error? She had been under considerable stress lately. Several people had begun questioning the originality of her recipes. Perhaps she was distracted and used the wrong proportions. Or," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "what if someone tampered with her ingredients before she began her demonstration? Someone who knew exactly which materials she would use and when?" She moved toward the demonstration counter, studying the arrangement of ingredients that remained from Mrs. Hartwell's preparation. Among the various containers was a jar labelled bitter almond paste, professional grade, which would have been the source for the dangerous component of the marzipan. "Inspector, I suggest you test this jar's contents very carefully. I suspect you'll find it's not what the label suggests." As the forensic team prepared to analyse the jar, Miss Marple noticed something else that had escaped earlier attention. On the shelf below the counter, partially hidden by a decorative cloth, was a second leather satchel nearly identical to Mrs. Hartwell's. This one, however, bore the initials CA in faded gold lettering. "Charlotte Ashford," Lucy breathed, recognising the bag immediately. "That was my grandmother's carrying case for her demonstrations. But how did it get here?" Miss Marple suspected she knew the answer, and it would prove central to solving the mystery of Mrs. Hartwell's death. The presence of Charlotte's bag suggested that someone had been conducting a very personal form of justice, one that reached beyond mere theft to encompass a deeper betrayal. Chapter 6. Christmas Past Unveiled. The discovery of Charlotte Ashford's demonstration bag created a palpable shift in the investigation's atmosphere. Inspector Slack ordered it retrieved and placed on a clear section of counter where everyone could see it. The leather was worn but well maintained, speaking to years of careful use. Lucy Pemberton reached toward it instinctively, then pulled her hand back as though the bag might burn her. "I haven't seen this since Grandmother died," she said softly. It disappeared along with everything else Mrs. Hartwell took. Inspector Slack opened the bag carefully, withdrawing its contents with methodical precision. Inside were tools and implements that matched those Mrs. Hartwell had been using, but these showed the patina of age and long use. There were also several packets of paper, tied with ribbon that had grown brittle with time. "Letters," Miss Marple observed with interest. "May we examine them, Inspector?" As Slack untied the first bundle, a photograph fell out. It showed two women standing before Pemberton's confectionery, though the shop sign read Ashford's Fine Confections in the image. The younger woman was clearly Charlotte, her face bright with pride. The older woman beside her bore a striking resemblance. "That's my great-grandmother Eleanor," Lucy identified, her voice thick with emotion. This photo was taken when Grandmother first opened the shop, before she married Grandfather Pemberton. Miss Marple studied the photograph carefully, noting the date written on the back. December 1952. "Your grandmother maintained the shop for quite some time then?" "Nearly 40 years," Lucy confirmed. "Even after marrying, she insisted on keeping it open. It was her life's work, her passion. The recipes were just part of it. She saw herself as maintaining a family tradition that went back generations. The letters proved even more revealing. They were correspondence between Charlotte and various culinary experts, discussing techniques and innovations in confectionery. Several mentioned a young woman named Vivian who showed remarkable aptitude for the craft. Mrs. Hartwell, Inspector Slack said, reading from one letter dated 3 years prior. Listen to this. Young Vivian has proven herself invaluable. Her natural talent reminds me of myself at that age. I've been teaching her our family methods, and she absorbs everything like a sponge. Perhaps I've finally found someone worthy to carry on the tradition. Lucy's face flushed with anger and hurt. She was going to teach Mrs. Hartwell instead of me? Her own granddaughter? Miss Marple noticed something significant in the letter's phrasing. Note the date, my dear. This was written when your grandmother's health was already declining. Perhaps she felt she needed to pass on her knowledge while she still could, and you were not yet ready to receive it. I was 23, Lucy protested. Old enough to learn. But perhaps not patient enough, Miss Marple suggested gently. Your grandmother was a perfectionist, was she not? And you were young, eager, perhaps wanting to modernize things? The accuracy of this observation was evident in Lucy's reluctant nod. She had indeed pressed her grandmother to update the shop, to embrace newer methods and equipment. Their disagreements on these matters had been well known in the village. Dr. Haydock, who had been examining some of the other items from the bag, made a startling discovery. There's a more recent letter here, dated just a week ago. It's addressed to Mrs. Hartwell. A week ago? Inspector Slack took the letter immediately. But Charlotte Pemberton has been dead for 2 years. The letter was written in a shaky hand, quite different from Charlotte's elegant script. As Slack read it aloud, the shop fell completely silent. Dear Vivian, I write to you from beyond the grave, as it were, through the hand of one who knew my true wishes. You have betrayed the trust I placed in you. The recipes were meant to be preserved and passed on with honour, not stolen and claimed as your own discoveries. The tradition you've corrupted will be your undoing. This Christmas, when you demonstrate the marzipan fruits that were my mother's greatest creation, remember that justice, like properly made confections, requires patience and precise timing. The bitter will overwhelm the sweet, as you overwhelmed my final years with your deception. Who wrote this? Slack demanded, looking around the room. Someone here sent this letter recently. Miss Marple had noticed another detail. The paper bore a watermark from Harrington Stationers, and she recalled seeing identical paper in the shop's office area. Moreover, the ink had the same distinctive blue-black tone she had observed in the shop's record books. Perhaps, she suggested, we should consider that Mrs. Hartwell was not the only one with access to Charlotte's belongings. Someone else knew where these items were hidden, someone who waited until the perfect moment to reveal them. She turned her attention to the assembled witnesses, studying each face carefully. Mrs. Bantry appeared genuinely shocked by the letter's contents. The vicar's wife seemed more puzzled than guilty, but there was one person whose expression had changed significantly during the letter's reading. Mr. Pemberton, Lucy's father, had remained in the background throughout the investigation, ostensibly continuing with shop business while the police worked. Now, however, his face had gone pale, and his hands gripped the doorframe as though he might collapse without its support. Mr. Pemberton, Miss Marple said kindly, I believe you have something to tell us. The man stepped forward slowly, his usual shopkeeper's cheerfulness entirely absent. Mother never fully trusted Vivian, he said quietly. Even as she taught her, even as she praised her talent, she had doubts. She told me before she died that she had made provisions, hidden certain things away in case her fears proved founded. What kind of provisions? Inspector Slack pressed. She created a test, Mr. Pemberton explained. She deliberately wrote incorrect proportions in several recipes in the book she knew Vivian would take. Small changes that would only matter if someone tried to claim the recipes as their own research. The marzipan fruit recipe was one of them. The real recipe called for 1 part bitter almond to 20. The altered version said 3 parts. The implications were staggering. Charlotte had anticipated the theft and prepared a trap that would only spring if the thief tried to profit from her deception. But this raised new questions about how the poisoned marzipan had come to be prepared and consumed. Then Mrs. Hartwell poisoned herself by following the false recipe, Dr. Haydock asked. No, Miss Marple said firmly. The Mrs. Hartwell we saw today knew the dangers of bitter almonds too well to make such an error. Someone else prepared those poisoned pieces, someone who had access to both the true and false recipes, someone who wanted poetic justice for Charlotte's betrayal. All eyes turned toward Lucy and her father, the two people with both motive and knowledge to execute such a plan. But Miss Marple sensed there was still another layer to uncover, another player in this tragedy who had not yet revealed themselves. Chapter 7. The Helper in the Shadows. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through Pemberton's confectionery as Inspector Slack considered the increasingly complex web of motives and opportunities surrounding Mrs. Hartwell's death. The revelation about Charlotte's deliberately falsified recipes had transformed the investigation from a simple poisoning into an elaborate trap years in the making. Yet the question remained, who had ultimately sprung that trap? Miss Marple had withdrawn slightly from the main group, positioning herself where she could observe everyone while appearing to simply rest. Her keen eyes noted the subtle tensions between the various parties. Lucy's barely controlled anger, her father's evident guilt, and the uncomfortable shuffling of the other witnesses, who had come expecting a pleasant Christmas demonstration and found themselves embroiled in murder. Mr. Pemberton, Inspector Slack said formally, I need you to explain exactly what you knew about your mother's plans and when you knew it. The shopkeeper seemed to age before their eyes as he prepared to speak. Mother told me about the altered recipes on her deathbed. She said if Vivian ever tried to publish them or claim them as her own, the errors would expose her. But she also said... He paused, struggling with the memory. She said she hoped Vivian would prove worthy of the trust after all, that perhaps she was wrong to doubt her. But Mrs. Hartwell did publish them, Lucy interjected bitterly. She took everything and made herself famous with our family's work. Yes, her father agreed heavily. When I saw the cookbook, when I recognized the recipes with those same deliberate errors, I knew Mother had been right to doubt her. But what could I do? As Lucy said, we had no legal proof. Miss Marple had been considering something else, a detail that had been bothering her since the investigation began. Mr. Pemberton. Who else has keys to the shop? Just Lucy and myself. Why? Because someone was here very early this morning, before either you or Lucy arrived. Someone who had time to prepare the poisoned marzipan and arrange for Mrs. Hartwell to consume it. She turned toward the assembled witnesses, her gaze settling on a figure who had remained notably quiet throughout the investigation. Mrs. Abigail Fletcher, the shop's long-time cleaning woman, stood near the back door, her worn coat pulled tightly around her thin frame. Mrs. Fletcher, Miss Marple said gently, you clean the shop every morning, don't you? The woman nodded slowly, her weathered face revealing nothing. And you were particularly close to Charlotte Pemberton, were you not? I seem to recall you worked for her for many years. 37 years, Mrs. Fletcher said quietly. Started when I was just a girl, and Mrs. Charlotte taught me everything, not just cleaning, but about the confections, about taking pride in the work. Inspector Slack focused his attention on this new development. Mrs. Fletcher, what time did you arrive this morning? 4 o'clock, same as always. I like to have everything spotless before the shop opens. And was anyone else here? Mrs. Fletcher hesitated, her gnarled hands twisting together. Mrs. Hartwell arrived about 5, said she needed to prepare for her demonstration. She had me help her carry things in from her car. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. What sort of things? Boxes of ingredients, her equipment and... Mrs. Fletcher paused, seeming to wrestle with her conscience, and a tray of marzipan fruits she said she'd prepared at home as examples. This revelation caused a stir among the witnesses. If Mrs. Hartwell had brought pre-made marzipan, it opened entirely new possibilities for how the poisoning had occurred. But we saw her make the marzipan during the demonstration, Mrs. Bantry protested. She shaped them right in front of us. She made some, Miss Marple corrected. But recall how she already had several completed pieces on display when the demonstration began. She said they were to show the various stages of decoration. Inspector Slack was already directing his team to search for evidence of these pre-made pieces. But Miss Marple had noticed something else about Mrs. Fletcher's demeanour. The cleaning woman kept glancing toward a supply closet near the back entrance, her anxiety increasing each time the police moved in that direction. "Mrs. Fletcher," Miss Marple said with characteristic gentleness, "I believe you have something you need to tell us. Something about Charlotte's final wishes." The cleaning woman's composure finally cracked. Tears began rolling down her cheeks as she reached into her coat pocket, withdrawing a small key on a ribbon. "Mrs. Charlotte gave me this before she died," she whispered. "Said if Vivian ever betrayed her trust, I was to use what was hidden in the old storage room. Said it would set things right." Inspector Slack immediately demanded the key, and Mrs. Fletcher led them to a section of the shop's basement that appeared to have been unused for years. Behind a stack of old crates they found a hidden compartment containing several items: Charlotte's original recipe notebooks, correspondence proving Mrs. Hartwell's theft, and most significantly, a jar of bitter almond extract with a note attached. The note in Charlotte's hand read, "For the hands of justice, 1 drop per piece, no more. The guilty will recognize the taste of their betrayal." "My God," Dr. Haydock breathed. "Charlotte planned this entire scenario?" "Not exactly," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "She provided the means for justice, but I don't believe she specified the method. Mrs. Fletcher, you used this extract on the marzipan Mrs. Hartwell brought, didn't you?" The cleaning woman nodded miserably. "I only wanted to make her sick, to embarrass her like she'd embarrassed Mrs. Charlotte's memory. I put 1 drop on each piece, just like the note said. But I must have used too much. Or maybe the extract was stronger than Mrs. Charlotte thought." "But how did you ensure Mrs. Hartwell would eat the poisoned piece?" Inspector Slack demanded. "I didn't," Mrs. Fletcher said simply. "I treated all the display pieces. I thought she'd taste one eventually during the demonstration, get sick, and everyone would know she was a fraud when she couldn't even recognize properly made marzipan from poisoned ones." Miss Marple considered this confession carefully. The plan had a certain poetic justice to it, but something still didn't align properly with the evidence. The forensic analysis had shown 2 distinct batches of marzipan, and Mrs. Fletcher's story only accounted for 1. "Lucy," she said suddenly, turning to the young woman, "you did make marzipan this morning, didn't you? But not to practice. You were trying to create pieces that looked exactly like Mrs. Hartwell's, intending to switch them during the demonstration." Lucy's face crumpled. "Yes," she admitted. "I wanted to humiliate her with her own false recipe. I used the proportions from the cookbook she published, the ones I knew were wrong. But when I arrived, Mrs. Hartwell's pieces were already on display, and there was no opportunity to switch them. I threw mine away." The full picture was finally becoming clear. 2 separate attempts at justice had converged: Mrs. Fletcher's poisoning of the display pieces and Lucy's creation of deliberately flawed marzipan. In a tragic irony, both had succeeded partially, creating a deadly combination that neither had intended. Chapter 8. The stage was set. Inspector Slack stood at the demonstration counter, arranging the evidence in chronological order, as he attempted to reconstruct the exact sequence of events that had led to Mrs. Hartwell's death. The various marzipan pieces had been separated and labelled, the bottles of extract and flavouring tested and documented, and witness statements carefully cross-referenced. Yet the complete picture remained frustratingly elusive. Miss Marple watched the inspector's methodical work, while her mind sorted through the human elements that mere physical evidence could never fully capture. The intersection of multiple plans for revenge, the weight of betrayed trust, and the terrible consequences of secrets held too long all swirled together in a tragedy that seemed almost Greek in its inevitability. "Let me understand this correctly," Inspector Slack said, addressing the assembled group. "Mrs. Fletcher poisoned the display pieces that Mrs. Hartwell brought. Lucy created additional poisoned pieces using the false recipe, but claims she threw them away. Mrs. Hartwell then conducted her demonstration, creating new pieces in front of witnesses, and somehow consumed a lethal dose. The mathematics don't quite add up." Dr. Haydock had been reviewing his medical observations and suddenly looked up with interest. "There's something else to consider. The speed of Mrs. Hartwell's reaction suggests she consumed more than just 1 piece of poisoned marzipan. The concentration would have needed to be either extremely high or consumed in multiple doses." "But we all saw her eat only 1 piece, Mrs. Bantry insisted. She was very particular about that, saying a professional never oversamples during a demonstration." Miss Marple had noticed something else during this discussion. Mr. Pemberton had grown increasingly agitated, his face flushed and his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. When he caught her observing him, he looked away quickly, but not before she saw the guilt written plainly across his features. "Mr. Pemberton," she said gently, "there's something more, isn't there? Something you haven't told us?" The shopkeeper's shoulders sagged in defeat. "The tea," he said quietly. "I put bitter almond extract in her tea." This confession sent shockwaves through the room. Inspector Slack immediately stepped forward, his expression severe. "You poisoned her tea? When? How?" "This morning, when she arrived," Mr. Pemberton explained miserably. "She always made herself a cup of my mother's special Christmas blend. She even had the audacity to call it her grandmother's recipe. I couldn't stand it anymore. I added several drops of the extract Mrs. Fletcher mentioned, thinking it would make her too ill to conduct the demonstration." The pieces were falling into place with horrifying clarity. 3 separate attempts to poison Mrs. Hartwell had occurred. Mrs. Fletcher's treated display pieces, Mr. Pemberton's contaminated tea, and Lucy's marzipan made with the deliberately falsified recipe. Each person had acted independently, unaware of the other's plans. "Death by 1,000 cuts," Miss Marple murmured, or in this case, death by multiple doses of poison, each intended merely to sicken or embarrass, but combining to create a lethal cocktail. But Lucy's poisoned marzipan was thrown away, Inspector Slack pointed out. She never had the opportunity to switch them. "Or, so she claims," the inspector added suspiciously. Miss Marple had been studying the arrangement of the display pieces, noting their positions and the pattern of disturbance where some had been moved or sampled. A thought occurred to her, and she turned toward the waste bin that had been searched earlier. "Sergeant, might we examine those discarded pieces more carefully? Not just for poison content, but for their decorative patterns." As the forensic team retrieved and examined the discarded marzipan, Miss Marple noticed Lucy growing increasingly nervous. The young woman kept glancing toward the demonstration counter, then back to the waste bin, as though calculating distances and possibilities. The sergeant's findings were revealing. These discarded pieces show the same colouring technique as some of the display pieces, but with subtle differences in the brushstrokes. It appears someone attempted to match Mrs. Hartwell's style, but couldn't quite replicate it perfectly. "Lucy," Miss Marple said firmly, "I believe you did switch some pieces, didn't you? Not all of them, but a few, during the confusion when people were arriving for the demonstration." Lucy's resistance finally crumbled entirely. "Just 3 pieces," she admitted. 3 apple-shaped ones near the front. I thought if she happened to choose one of those made with the false recipe, she'd immediately taste the difference and be exposed as not knowing the real recipes. I never imagined she'd already consumed poison in her tea, or that Mrs. Fletcher had treated the other pieces. The full horror of the situation was now apparent. Mrs. Hartwell had been unknowingly surrounded by poison from the moment she entered the shop. Her tea had been contaminated, her display pieces treated with extract, and additional poisoned pieces placed among them. When she had selected and consumed what she believed to be her own safe creation, she had actually chosen one of Lucy's replacements, adding the final fatal dose to what her system had already absorbed. "It's like a grotesque parody of Murder on the Orient Express," Mrs. Bantry observed with a shudder. "Everyone had a hand in it, though none intended murder." Inspector Slack was clearly struggling with the legal implications. 3 people had independently poisoned Mrs. Hartwell, each believing they were acting alone, each intending only to embarrass or sicken her. The question of legal culpability would be complex indeed. "There's still one matter unresolved," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "The letter sent to Mrs. Hartwell last week, warning her about justice being served. Who wrote that?" Mrs. Fletcher raised her hand slowly. "I did, with Mr. Pemberton's help. We wanted her to know that someone knew the truth, that her deception hadn't gone unnoticed. We hoped she might confess, return what she'd stolen." "Instead, it probably put her on guard," Dr. Haydock observed. "She might have been more careful if she hadn't received it." "Or," Miss Marple suggested, "she might have tested her display pieces more carefully, discovered the poison, and lives would have been saved while criminals were exposed." The tragedy's full scope was now apparent. A woman's greed and deception had triggered 3 separate attempts at revenge, none coordinated, all ultimately contributing to her death. Charlotte Pemberton's legacy had indeed been preserved, but at a cost none of the participants had intended or desired. Chapter 9. Justice has many faces. The evening had descended upon St. Mary Mead with the gentle quiet that often follows traumatic events. Inside Pemberton's confectionery, now transformed into an official crime scene, Inspector Slack faced the unprecedented challenge of determining criminal responsibility when 3 separate people had unknowingly collaborated in a poisoning. The witnesses had been permitted to sit while he consulted with his superiors by telephone, and the atmosphere was heavy with exhaustion and dread. Miss Marple sat quietly observing the 3 confessed poisoners. Mrs. Fletcher appeared to have aged a decade in the past few hours, her loyalty to Charlotte Pemberton having led her to an act she never could have imagined herself committing. Mr. Pemberton stared at his hands as though they belonged to a stranger, while Lucy sat rigid with shock at the consequences of her attempted revenge. "The legal complexities here are extraordinary," Inspector Slack announced, returning from his telephone consultation. 3 people independently poisoned the victim, each without knowledge of the other's actions. None intended murder, yet murder resulted. The Crown Prosecutor is travelling here personally to assess the situation. Dr. Haydock, who had remained to provide medical expertise, offered his professional opinion. From a medical standpoint, any single dose might have made Mrs. Hartwell ill, but probably wouldn't have killed her. It was the cumulative effect that proved fatal. The tea alone would have caused discomfort. The treated display pieces might have induced more severe symptoms. Lucy's Marzipan, with its concentrated false recipe, delivered what would have been the fatal dose, but only because her system was already compromised. Rather like 3 people each adding what they think is a safe amount of salt to a soup, Mrs. Bantry observed, only to create something entirely inedible. Except in this case, Miss Marple added gently, the soup proved deadly. She rose from her chair and moved toward the demonstration counter, where the various pieces of evidence remained displayed. The tragedy of the scene struck her anew, all this destruction stemming from one woman's theft of another's legacy. Yet even that theft had been complicated, born perhaps as much from genuine affection for Charlotte's work as from greed. "Inspector," she said thoughtfully, "might I share an observation about Mrs. Hartwell's character that could prove relevant?" Slack nodded, having learned to value Miss Marple's insights, even when they seemed tangential. "Mrs. Hartwell was not entirely the villain she's been painted to be," Miss Marple began. "Yes, she stole Charlotte's recipes and claimed them as her own. But consider how faithfully she preserved them, how carefully she demonstrated the techniques. In her own twisted way, she was keeping Charlotte's legacy alive, even if she was claiming credit for it." "That hardly excuses theft," Lucy said bitterly. "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but it might explain why Charlotte gave her the recipes in the first place, even with the deliberate errors. Perhaps she saw in Vivian someone who truly loved the craft, even if she didn't trust her completely." She picked up Charlotte's original recipe book, handling it with the reverence due to a historical artifact. These recipes were meant to be shared, to bring joy to others through the creation of beautiful confections. Charlotte knew that. She wanted them preserved and passed on, even if she had doubts about who would do the passing. "What are you suggesting?" Inspector Slack asked. "I'm suggesting that this tragedy arose from a fundamental misunderstanding. Mrs. Hartwell believed she had earned the right to the recipes through her devotion to Charlotte. The family believed they had been stolen. Both were partially correct, and both were partially wrong." Mr. Pemberton spoke up unexpectedly. "Mother did say, near the end, that she wished Lucy had Vivian's patience and Vivian had Lucy's birthright. She saw qualities in both of them that the other lacked." This revelation cast the entire situation in a different light. Charlotte had been caught between 2 potential heirs, her granddaughter, who had the right, but perhaps not the readiness, and her companion, who had the skill, but not the legitimate claim. None of which changes the fact that 3 people poisoned Mrs. Hartwell, Inspector Slack reminded them. The law must take its course. "Indeed, it must," Miss Marple agreed. "But the law also considers intent, does it not? None of these 3 intended murder. They each, in their own misguided way, sought to restore what they saw as justice. Mrs. Fletcher acted from loyalty to her deceased employer, Mr. Pemberton from a father's desire to protect his daughter's inheritance, Lucy from a granddaughter's wish to reclaim her family legacy. The Crown Prosecutor arrived as Miss Marple was speaking, a distinguished gentleman named Sir William Petersham, who was known for his measured approach to complex cases. He listened carefully as Inspector Slack summarised the situation, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful as the full complexity became apparent. "This is indeed unprecedented," Sir William said. "Finally. 3 independent poisoners, none aware of the others, none intending fatal harm. It's like a legal, perfect storm." He interviewed each of the accused separately, with Miss Marple permitted to observe given her role in uncovering the truth. Each told their story with complete honesty, perhaps recognising that further deception would only worsen their situation. As the evening wore on, Sir William made his preliminary determination. "While charges must be filed, I believe the circumstances warrant consideration of lesser charges than murder. Attempted assault, perhaps, or reckless endangerment. The fact that none of you knew of the other's actions, and none intended death, will be significant factors. Moreover," he added, looking at each of them in turn, "the victim was herself guilty of theft and fraud, though that doesn't excuse vigilante justice. This entire situation arose from a series of betrayals and misunderstandings that spiraled out of control." Miss Marple felt a profound sadness as she watched these 3 essentially good people face the consequences of their actions. Each had acted from understandable, even admirable motives: loyalty, paternal love, and desire for justice. Yet those motives had led them to commit terrible acts. "There's one more thing," she said quietly. "Charlotte's true legacy isn't just the recipes. It's the love of the craft, the dedication to quality, the joy of creating something beautiful. That legacy has been damaged by all of this, but it need not be destroyed." She turned to Lucy. "You have your grandmother's recipes now, the real ones. You have the knowledge, the shop, and the opportunity to carry on the tradition properly. The question is whether you can do so with the wisdom to learn from these tragic events." Lucy nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. "I will, Miss Marple. I'll make sure grandmother's legacy lives on the way she intended." As the police prepared to formally charge the 3 poisoners, Miss Marple reflected on the case's many ironies. Justice had indeed been served, though not in the way anyone had planned. The truth about Mrs. Hartwell's deceptions had been exposed, Charlotte's recipes had been returned to their rightful heir, and those who had sought revenge through poison would face appropriate consequences. Chapter 10. Sweet Endings and Bitter Truths. 3 months had passed since that fatal December afternoon, and spring had begun to touch St. Mary Mead with its gentle warmth. Miss Marple made her way along the high street, noting with approval how the village had settled back into its familiar rhythms after the shocking events at Pemberton's confectionery. The shop itself had reopened just the week before, and she had purposefully chosen this morning to pay her first visit since the tragedy. The bell above the door chimed pleasantly as she entered, and she was immediately struck by the changes Lucy Pemberton had made. The demonstration area had been removed entirely, replaced with comfortable seating where customers could enjoy tea and freshly made confections. The walls now displayed photographs from the shop's long history, including several of Charlotte Ashford in her younger days, working alongside her mother Eleanor. "Miss Marple," Lucy greeted her warmly, though there was a gravity to her manner that hadn't existed before the events of December. "How wonderful to see you. Please sit wherever you'd like. I'll bring you some tea." Miss Marple chose a table near the window where she could observe both the shop's interior and the street outside. Lucy returned shortly with a porcelain tea service and a plate of beautifully crafted marzipan fruits, their colours delicate and natural, their shapes perfect miniatures of nature's bounty. "These are from grandmother's original recipe," Lucy said quietly. "The real one, with the proper proportions. I've been practicing every day, trying to achieve the standard she set." Miss Marple selected a tiny pear and tasted it carefully. The flavour was exquisite, sweet almond with just the faintest hint of bitter to provide depth. the texture smooth and pliable. "Perfect," she pronounced. "Charlotte would be proud." Lucy sat down across from her, clearly needing to talk. "The legal proceedings concluded last week. Did you hear?" Miss Marple nodded. She had followed the case closely, though she had not attended the hearings. 6 months suspended sentence for your father and Mrs. Fletcher. 2 years probation for you because of the concentration in your pieces. It seems just, given the circumstances. "More than just," Lucy agreed. "We all could have faced much worse. Sir William was remarkably understanding, considering we had actually poisoned someone regardless of our intentions." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, sipping their tea and contemplating the events that had brought them to this point. The shop was quiet, though several customers browsed the display cases where Lucy had arranged various confections with obvious care and pride. "I've been thinking about Mrs. Hartwell," Lucy said suddenly. "I hated her for so long, but now I realize she was as trapped by her deception as we were by our anger about it. She could never truly enjoy her success because it was built on lies." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "She loved the craft genuinely, I believe. Her demonstrations, however fraudulently obtained the recipes, showed real passion for the art of confectionery. In different circumstances, she and Charlotte might have been true partners." "That's what's so tragic about it all," Lucy agreed. "Everyone involved loved the same thing, these recipes, this tradition, the joy of creating something beautiful and delicious. That shared love should have brought us together, not driven us to such terrible acts." The shop bell chimed again, and Mrs. Fletcher entered hesitantly. She had aged considerably since December, her hair now completely grey where it had been merely streaked before. She approached their table with obvious uncertainty. "Lucy, Miss Marple," she said softly, "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," Lucy said, gesturing to an empty chair. "Please, join us." Mrs. Fletcher sat carefully as though afraid she might break something. "I wanted to apologize again, Lucy. Every day I think about what I did, how I betrayed the trust your grandmother placed in me." "We all betrayed her trust," Lucy replied gently. "We took her desire for justice and twisted it into something she never would have wanted. Grandmother believed in doing things properly with patience and skill. We tried to take shortcuts to revenge, and look where it led us." Miss Marple observed this exchange with approval. The healing process had clearly begun, though she knew it would take much longer for all wounds to fully close. The shared guilt had created an unexpected bond between the 3 conspirators, a recognition that they had all failed the woman they had sought to honour. "I've made a decision," Lucy announced. "I'm going to publish Grandmother's recipes, the real ones, in a proper cookbook. But I'm going to include the full story, her work, Mrs. Hartwell's theft, and our terrible response to it. People should know the truth, all of it." "That's very brave," Miss Marple said, "and very wise. Secrets and deceptions were at the heart of this tragedy. Honesty, however painful, is the only antidote." Mr. Pemberton emerged from the shop's back room, carrying a tray of freshly baked Christmas puddings, even though it was now spring. "I've been perfecting Mother's recipe," he explained, setting them down. "Thought we should offer them year-round, not just at Christmas. Mother always said good pudding knew no season." The 4 of them sat together, unlikely companions brought together by tragedy and its aftermath. They spoke of Charlotte, sharing memories and stories, bringing her presence into the room through their recollections. It was a form of communion, a way of honouring the dead while acknowledging the terrible mistakes made in her name. "You know," Mrs. Fletcher said thoughtfully, "Mrs. Charlotte once told me that recipes were like stories. They get passed down, changed a little with each telling, but the heart of them remains the same. She said that was how traditions stayed alive, by adapting while preserving their essence." "Then that's what we'll do," Lucy declared. "We'll preserve the essence of her work, while adapting to our new understanding of what happened. No more secrets, no more deceptions, just honest craft and genuine tradition." As Miss Marple prepared to leave, Lucy presented her with a small box of marzipan fruits. "Made with the correct recipe," she assured her. "I triple-check the proportions now." Walking home through the village, Miss Marple reflected on the case and its resolution. Justice had been served in its formal sense, with legal consequences for illegal acts, but perhaps more. Importantly, truth had been revealed and understanding achieved. The three poisoners had learned the terrible cost of taking justice into their own hands, while the village had learned the danger of keeping secrets and nursing grievances. The marzipan fruits in her box were perfect replicas of nature's bounty, sweet with just a hint of bitterness to provide complexity. Rather like life itself, Miss Marple thought. The sweet and the bitter mixed together, creating something more interesting than either alone could provide. As she reached her cottage, she paused to look back toward the village. Pemberton's confectionery stood on the high street as it had for generations, a testament to tradition and continuity. The tragedy of Mrs. Hartwell's death would not be forgotten, but neither would it destroy what Charlotte Ashford and her mother Eleanor had built. Dear listeners of Velvet Clues, our tale concludes where it began, in a village where everyone knows everyone else's business, yet secrets still manage to flourish in the shadows. The case of the Christmas marzipan reminds us that justice and revenge are not the same thing, that good people can do terrible things when driven by pain and anger, and that the truth, however bitter, is always preferable to the sweet taste of deception. I'm Connor, thanking you for joining me tonight. Until our next mystery, may your own secrets be harmless and your marzipan properly proportioned. Good night.